Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. In this week, our readings and materials and our discussions are going to focus on this idea of enslavement and eugenics. You're going to be reading, if you haven't already read, chapter 3 out of the Almost All Aliens book. You're watching the Naomi's Notes mini lecture right now. Also, please watch the video on cultural appropriation, as well as the short video on genetics, eugenics, and ethics. I've also posted, as usual, a couple of other resources in case you're more interested in any of these topics. There is a longer PBS video on eugenics that is very good, as well as an article on disability critical race theory, or DISCRIT. But I'll give you a quick overview of some of the concepts that I think is important to draw on from all of these in this video lecture. New this week, we have our first quiz. The way the quiz works, it's 5 multiple choice questions and then 1 short essay question. The multiple choice questions are worth 1 point each, and then the essay is worth 5 points. So it's 10 points total and 10% of your grade. You have all week to work on the quiz, so there are no time limits, but you only have 1 chance to complete the quiz. So once you open it up and you're working on it, you are able to access past resources and readings as you need to answer the questions. But once you submit it, it'll be finished. So just so you know how that's working. And another thing, if it's not working like that for you, please let me know right away. I think I've set it up correctly, but I've never used the quiz feature in Canvas before. So let me know if I didn't do it right, and I will do my best to fix it quickly for you. You do need to take the quiz by Sunday of this week. So this week, our book chapters and some of the materials pointed out some interesting concepts. The first one that your book picks up at the end of chapter 3 and the video on cultural appropriation looks at is this idea of cultural appropriation. This idea of a group, particularly a group in power, in this case, white people, taking the cultural products of a particular culture or groups of people of color and using those products for their own benefit. So we see this in the video. It has examples of Katy Perry, certainly Miley Cyrus comes to mind, Taylor Swift, Justin Timberlake has been accused of cultural appropriation. And what's significant about these people is that they are all, of course, celebrities and performers, and they actually amass great amounts of money by using these different cultural products for their own use. Sometimes they make fun of those cultures. You can see them kind of edge into that, particularly when we're talking about Halloween costumes that are culturally appropriating. I think the video shows a picture of a white guy wearing a sombrero and a mustache, culturally appropriating Mexican culture. And that's harmful because not only is he using these cultural products and mimicking them, but through that mimicry, he is making fun of them. He's teasing them. So it's going a step further than perhaps people who are using different cultural products as a moneymaker or a way to make them seem cool. Certainly Miley Cyrus used a lot of Black cultural items to make her seem cool. And to a degree, there was some mimicry, I think, in her performances of Black culture. But she definitely was making a lot of money based on appropriating in that way. One thing that I think is interesting that I've done in my research looking at cultural appropriation and going back to this idea of whiteness as property um, is the idea that particularly when we're talking about culturally appropriating indigenous cultures, um, what we see is some cultures, for instance, in Maori indigenous cultures, um, the cultures produce different types of art. And it's not like a person signs their art necessarily when they're done, but throughout their rituals and throughout the culture building, they have these shared cultural products. They have different symbols that mean something within their culture. And so they're shared. No one person owns that symbol. But what we see happen, particularly along with white entitlement in New Zealand, for instance, in this example, is, for instance, a New Zealand airline took an indigenous symbol from a Maori tribal group and put it on their airplanes and made it part of their branding for their airlines. And this is, of course, cultural appropriation, as we've discussed already, making money by using a cultural symbol as a brand for a commercial product. But when we understand how things like property law and copyright and trademark law work, and then moving back to the United States, but broadly as well, in the United States, if an indigenous group has a symbol or has an artifact or a piece of art that is a community symbol, if they haven't gone through trademarking processes, which they haven't normally because it is a shared piece of art or symbol, if a white person takes it and uses it, they can actually get a trademark and copyright that very symbol, and then they own it. So then the people who had created that symbol, indigenous groups in the United States in this instance, no longer have a right to the symbol that they created themselves as a community. So when we take it a step further, we can see how insidious cultural appropriation can get and does get. So it's not just for good fun, dressing up like a different cultural group on Halloween or at a frat party, which we see these things happening again and again. But it goes much further than that and really is another enactment of this whiteness as property, where white people think not only do they own everything that belongs to them that has been stolen, as we've talked about through settler colonialism, but then anything that you create, I can also take and ultimately own and make my own as well. So I wanted to touch on that to make sure we had a broad understanding of how cultural appropriation works and of the violence related to cultural appropriation. The other thing we talk about this week is this history of eugenics. You saw it in the short video and in the long video if you decided to watch them both. This idea that early in American history, white Europeans tried to create a master race, and they did that by sterilizing people who they determined were disabled or feeble-minded was the language they used. There's also a long history of sterilizing prisoners or people who had broken the law, criminals, to kind of weed that out of society. But what we saw ultimately happening, which is no surprise given what we know about our nation's history, is that it was largely people of color who were being sterilized so that they could not reproduce, as well as people who were disabled. And this is where the discrit idea, I think, is prominent and important to understand. So the idea behind discrit is that disability and race have never been inseparable. So if we go back to what we learned earlier in these chapters, for instance, enslaved people being considered 3/5 of a person. They were also considered mentally inferior to white Europeans. So we see this long history of ability being related with whiteness. If you were white, then you were smart and you knew what you were doing, particularly if you were a white man. Conversely, if you were a person of color, and particularly and especially a woman of color, not to mention had an LGBTQ identity, although it was not called that at the time, those things were diagnosed as mental disabilities. So when we understand the history, particularly related to eugenics, and understand that ability and whiteness have always been together, it has great implications for what we see happening today, when we realize there's also not a clear separation between racism and ableism, is what is argued in this article. What else was I going to say about discrit? So as I was going to give some modern day examples or implications. So one of these modern day implications is looking at racism and whiteness within the medical field. For instance, I don't know if any of you listen to NPR. I'm kind of an NPR junkie, that and Democracy Now! But last year they had did a piece on all of these studies that had come out describing how many white medical residents, as well as trained doctors, believed that Black people experienced pain far less than white people. And that was actually showing up in how they were treating pain for Black patients. So the implications of this is huge. You have undertreated or Black populations being undertreated for pain and continuing to suffer. And this racism has been directly linked through different research to how predominantly white doctors, the racist ideas that they have based on this long legacy, again, in not only equating race with biology and thinking that there are very real biological differences, which there are not, and also this idea of tying ability with race and not being able to separate those two things. So it shows up in the medical field, in the healthcare system as well today, even though eugenics as a system, as the video talks about, is no longer in practice that we know of. So I'm going to stop there because I've given you plenty of videos to watch this week. Again, if you have questions about something that's not working for you, I'd encourage you to go ahead and put those in the discussion board, the Discuss with Naomi, just so that other people can see the responses. Of course, if it's a personal question, email me directly, and I will stay on top of that and get back to you as quick as I can. Good luck on the quiz. If you're getting stuck on something, go back and check some of our materials, because you'll find all the answers there. And I'm hoping that this week we could talk a little bit about particularly eugenics and cultural appropriation. I'll keep the prompts down to 2 this week, since I do know you have a quiz. So I'm looking forward to our discussions, and see you soon.